Australia has already had a Royal Commission into banks apply it. So, Craig, this week also in Parliament, the big issue actually publicly that has dominated Parliament is the Royal Commission into banks. And there's been all these amazing shenanigans. It's an interesting Parliament with such close numbers, so people can see that on the news themselves. But you know, the question is, okay, what do we do about this situation with the banks? It's happening at a time of a looming banking crisis. That's what people have to understand. There's a crisis coming. So this week, CNBC reported a banker fearing a economic nuclear winter. That was the quote. They said, if you thought the first half of 2016 was bad for big international banks, quote, speaking on the condition of anonymity due to the sensitive nature of the topic, a source from a major investment bank told CNBC that financial services firms have put together a strategy in place that takes into account the worst case scenario that could happen by the end of this year. So that was CNBC. In Italy, you've got the world's oldest bank, Monte dei Paschi. There's been this drama, never-ending saga about bailing out this thing because it's in a terrible way. The latest bailout is now unravelling, and JP Morgan's scrambling to force the Italian government to get together with other governments and actually do this thing. Because the consequences, if a bank goes under, of a chain reaction. That's the fear, right? And then Bloomberg News reported this on Tuesday, that the derivatives market is set to blow, and their headline is, did Brexit turn the derivatives market toxic? And what they've noted was that no one betting on currency rate fluctuations between the British pound and the euro anticipated the Brexit vote, right? Well, these are all bets, and if you don't anticipate the possibility of something going different, then you're going to lose big time, and these are losses that are in the system now, right? So this is all brewing over there, and it's the backdrop to our discussion about a Royal Commission. If a global banking crisis happens, it'll hit Australia hard. Our debt has never been higher. It was much higher than 2008, and we've got this housing bubble that's just set to blow, and if it blows, then the whole banking system here goes with it. So therefore we've got this discussion. Now, let us say this. An investigation of the banks is always a good idea. And we've held up the model here many times of what's called known as the Pecora Commission, a 2-week Senate committee investigation in the United States just before Franklin Roosevelt came to power, which ripped the mask off the bankers and showed them for what they were. And actually, the people reporting it invented the term banksters because of that commission there. Australia needs that kind of thing. However, the question of a Royal Commission is a little bit different. Now, if that's the way it's going to happen, fine, but that's going to take a long time. We've already had a Royal Commission in banks. People may not understand that. And that came about in the 1930s. So what we're going to do is play a video. And this is what this video is from the Australian TV series Power Without Glory, which dramatised the 1930s debates over whether or not the government should issue new money through the Commonwealth Bank to create jobs to alleviate unemployment and the depression. Red Ted Theodore, you'll see speaking, said we've got to do it. He was the treasurer, this is the Labor government, he ordered the Commonwealth Bank to do it, and the governor of the Commonwealth Bank, Sir Robert Gibson, said, I bloody well won't. And later on, in 1937, a Royal Commission was called into that. So have a look at the video quickly.
You can blame the nationalists if you like, but it won't make any difference to the public out there. And it won't get the country out of debt. Now, the fact is, Australia's been living beyond its means. We've got much too high a deficit. We're down on our balance of payments to the tune of,
The latest figure is £193 million.
Oh, that's terrible.
And our credit rating overseas is falling all the time.
Now, we've heard all this, Joe. Get to the point.
Yes, come on.
Let Mr. Lygon speak. Now, the rest of you have had your say.
Well, the point is that we're going bankrupt. The talk at this time about spending more money,
I'm talking about issuing it, not spending it.
I fail to see the difference.
There's a very big one.
Ask anyone in business.
You ask them. You got more friends there.
Settle down, Frank, please.
I was about to say, ask anyone in business, and they'll tell you that if they ran their enterprises on the basis of spending money they haven't got, they wouldn't just end up bankrupt. They'd be prosecuted for fraud.
Well, look, we're not running a business. We're running a country. And that's rather more complex. Too complex for you to understand, apparently.
Well, the same rules apply.
No.
It's plain common sense.
You must not never see issue.
All right. But just exactly what are you proposing, Joe?
Economies. Try to bolster our gold reserves. And I think we should postpone our plans on social services. The government's got to set an example. We won't get back on our feet without tightening our belts.
Plenty of room for you to tighten yours, brother. The bloke in the street's down to his last notch now. There's thousands of them out of work. The men who put us here. The banks are squeezing them. The employers are squeezing them. Big business. We should be stopping it. They're crying out to us to protect them. Do you want us to squeeze them as well?
We're not helping them by living in a dream world. We must face facts.
Look, there's nothing fairy tale about a fiduciary issue. Now, I'll spell it out again because I don't think everyone around this table's understood it. 1, we expand the note issue by £18 million. 2, a third of the money goes to help the farmers. 3, the rest of the money is deployed to create new jobs. Now, 4, new jobs means increased production, and increased production equals real wealth. In other words, in a few months, the fiduciary issue will no longer be fiduciary. It'll be backed by real productivity.
Well, if it's that simple, if it's that sure a thing, why are our bankers all opposed to it?
Because like you, if you'll excuse my saying so, they know all about running a business. They know next to nothing about running a country.
So Craig, that person who's finished speaking there, that was the Treasurer, Red Ted Theodore. That's what he wanted it for. That was his logic, and the Commonwealth Bank then stopped him. So after the break, we're going to talk about what the consequences were. All right, so welcome back to the CEC Report, where we're discussing Australia has already had a Royal Commission to banks apply it. And Craig, before the break, we showed the video of Red Ted Theodore saying we need to put money out into the economy through the Commonwealth Bank, and at the time the Commonwealth Bank refused. So that led to a Royal Commission in 1936, which handed down its findings in 1937.
Can I just say, Robbie, what Ted Theodore was trying to do was he was going to create $18 million of what's called pounds, of fiduciary credit, which is basically credit issued by the Commonwealth Bank without the backing of gold, because at that time it had to be backed by gold. And this was to be spent into the public works and other sorts of infrastructure projects.
6 million for farmers, 12 million for public
And the
works.
idea was to stimulate demand, because there was a big deflationary cycle at that time in the economy, and the entire economy was collapsing because people weren't spending, they weren't buying things, right? So that's what it was about. Now, that whole idea, right, would have saved Australia from the Depression. It was a political decision, as you mentioned by Robert Gibson, not to do that. So the entirety of the suffering that was done through the Great Depression was in fact a political decision.
So the question was, what right did Sir Robert Gibson, who was the governor of the bank, but the bank was owned by the government, so therefore he's a public servant, what right did he have to refuse an order from the government? And what this Royal Commission did, and it was called by the Lions Menzies government. They weren't friends of the Labor view, right? But the Royal Commission nevertheless ruled that at the end of the day, the government is the ultimate authority in the banking system, that Gibson should have accepted obeyed the orders back then. The government, and Craig, when they say government, they don't say an independent statutory authority like the Reserve Bank that's independent of politics. No, the politically motivated elected government is in charge of the financial system. That was the ruling. And it was those rulings were ignored until Chifley, who as I said, had been on the Royal Commission himself, and Curtin came to power in World War II, and then they applied them to great success. And what they did is they took all the private banks and put them on the strongest leash you can imagine. They made them put 20% of their capital in the Commonwealth Bank and keep it there, so that's what made them secure. And the Commonwealth Bank called the shots. Now, at no time under this regime were those banks not profitable. No. They were always profitable, right? But the economy benefited first before they did. That's how the system worked.
They were also forced to actually extend credit into areas where they didn't want to, like agriculture, for example.
And now I want to mention two things in the time I've got left. Chifley has gone down in history. Some people confuse him as a communist because he tried to nationalise the banks. That was his secondary option. All he wanted to do was make these wartime controls permanent. That were the recommendations of the Royal Commission. And the private banking system, organised a rebellion against him, basically, with the Liberal Party. Ironically, what he proposed has sit in the post-GFC period when people motivated to save private banks has happened. The British government nationalised all its major banks in 2008 to save them, right? Was that communism? No. And there's a guy who's part of the Minneapolis Fed in the United States named Neil Kashkari. He is calling for the same thing where Chifley said banks should be treated like utilities, electricity companies, gas companies, etc., and not private companies, and they should have 20% of their capital in the Commonwealth Bank, etc. He's proposing the same thing because that's the crisis has brought us to that point, right? And so Chifley was well ahead of his time. My point is, it's there. We had the recommendations. What the government of Australia has to do now is stop shirking its responsibilities, take charge of the banks, and make them do what they've got to do.